Hi guys, this is Joe Goodspeed from Diamondback Fly Rods. We're out here trout fishing in Vermont. It's the middle of May, and we were trout fishing this morning. Got our hands on a couple nice wild trout in a small freestone that we hiked around on, and now we're taking a break here in a little tributary of it, and we're going to just talk about some of the springtime trout season or things that are fresh in my mind that are topical to helping get yourself on some of these nice adult fish that are tough and have other people chasing them around on the same streams. You know, in Vermont, all across Vermont, there's lots of streams that don't have a great population of fish, but have the capacity to produce some nice sized fish in these waters that aren't stocked and don't have much. And that's what we were fishing today. I managed to get my hands on a couple nice, solid freestone fish, about 17 to 19 inches between the two fish. And those are the adult fish here. In waters like this, there are larger fish, but most of the big pools have a couple fish in the size range of the ones that I caught is what's realistic of what you're fishing over. So one of the things that we just ran into today is we saw recent tracks from other anglers. And whenever I see that, for me, it's a very important thing to try to understand what the other people are doing when they're fishing in front of me. And so oftentimes, if you look at the tracks and you look at where they walk up to the water and how they approach the pool, you can get an idea of what they're doing and probably what type of presentations they're showing to the fish. So in a pool that we fished earlier, a nice pool that definitely a lot of people are likely to target because of the quality of the water, a nice deep big holding pool. We saw a set of tracks coming in to the top end of the pool and coming in from the pool below and not upstream from the bank of the pool, which told me that that person had been fishing water downstream and strategically walked all the way up to the very top end of this big pool to fish that pool in a certain way that a top end approach is likely to benefit the tactic, and that would be lure fishing. For most of the time when you see good lure fishermen targeting medium-sized streams or rivers like this, more, not the rivers, but the larger streams that you can cover in one cast, oftentimes they'll stand upstream from the holding water and kind of cast with the current so that their lure covers the best holding water. And that's the way that the guys that catch the nice fish that we're also after, that's the way they usually set up to get the fish out of the pools. So I know when people come in at the top end of the pool, they're likely to be covering the pool with that lure presentation. And so if I see recent tracks coming up and covering a pool from that sort of angle, I expect it's a lure fisherman, and I think of it like as if I had first fished the pool doing something like a lure presentation, which would be like a streamer presentation. If you were set up above, you'd be pulling the streamer back up to you. So knowing that those fish had recently seen some sort of presentation pulled back up to them at the top end of the pool, I set up at the lower end of the pool and I dead drifted presentations through the run. And on the first presentation, I got a nice about 17-inch fish, ate the fly that we caught there. But I know that, you know, that fish had already seen something recently that it probably had not gotten caught on if it was pouncing on the first dead drifting presentation. So maybe that lure fisherman interacted with some fish in that pool, maybe they didn't, but the fish that were not interested in that type of upstream pull presentation are going to be the fish that are most likely to interact with the next angler coming through the pool. So, you know, knowing that, and it might go the other way around where if you know someone just nymphed the heck out of a piece of water, you might come through and fish a big streamer over it just to show the pool something completely different than what that last angler did. So that goes both ways. So, you know, just that probably helped us produce that fish. I probably would have fished the pool the same way, to be honest, because, you know, that's the way I approach the pool. But had I seen that someone had nymphed a pool that I really wanted to fish right in front of me, that's when it would come into play that I might use a weird fly use a weird presentation, really start off doing something out of the standard deeper water nymphing stuff that I would usually do if I knew that I was the first one approaching a piece of water in a little while. How long it takes for a fish to reset when a fish has been caught in a pool, it's a big variable, because from water to water, depending on how much pressure the fish see and on the fish, you know, how smart the fish is and how much experience that fish has with seeing other fish caught around it, whatever the factors are that spook the fish, you know, when you catch another fish around them. I typically find that when you take any sort of an adult fish from a pool, the likelihood that you're going to take a bigger fish than that one from the pool, if the water is clear and the stream isn't that big, it's really low. If you're on big water or really turbid water, those are two things that can cloud, you know, awareness of what's going on in a pool. And if the water is especially pretty turbid and high, that I think is out of play. And if I catch a fish in a pool in high turbid water, I'm not that afraid that a better fish might have been spooked. But in normal water conditions, and right now we had heavy water a few days ago, but now the water has come down to pretty typical spring levels, pretty clear water here. These fish are well aware of our approach. We're more likely to be spooking the fish before we even fish. And when a fish gets caught and that fish is thumping, making the vibration, flashing, and you're crunching gravel around, going and trying to land that fish, all of that is a pretty big red flag for a smart wild, you know, fish that's still in that pool seeing that happen. So, you know, I'll cover a nice piece of water after catching a fish out of it, but it's not that frequently when the water is in normal conditions and streams this size that's going to produce much of a fish. So that's a bit of a diminishing returns thing. I'm going to follow up on what we were just talking about with when a fish is caught from a pool and resetting, and go to an even more likely situation where you're fishing a pool and you miss a bite. So for me, especially on bigger water, when I'm using a streamer or a bigger fly, there was one of these big mayflies, that's a March Brown. When I miss a bite, very often the bites that you miss are going to be some of the better fish that are bigger, smarter fish that are more likely to spit a fly out fast, especially on the first cast. Small fish also sometimes can feel, you know, like a fish spitting the fly out, but when you make a good presentation right in the good part of a pool on your first cast and you distinctly miss a bite, even if you don't stick that fish, but you know for sure something happened, that's really good feedback, because that shows you both that there is a nice active fish that's willing to bite, the type of thing that you wanted to fish, and it shows you where in the pool exactly that bite happens and where in the water column that bite happens. Because from fish to fish, they can have a different mood as far as whether they want to chase forward and to attack a food item if they're really hungry maybe, or if they're a more cautious fish that often lets the food come all the way to them before they eat it. If you know that a bite is going to likely happen or has happened once in a spot, you haven't hooked the fish high in the water column as you drift into it or all the way towards the bottom, you can prepare the next time you fish that pool, and you can rest that pool for just a little while and fish that pool in the same day and expect that fish to reset if you don't hook the fish. If you miss a fish in a nice pool, you can rest that fish, come back and expect that there's probably a bite right in the same area where you had that bite. And if you know the depth and the timing of when it happens and how far your fly is sunk into water, it's likely the fish will bite the same fly. Or oftentimes if you switch flies, sometimes that will give you a better opportunity to get that fish to bite again. Or if you know where a fish is, you might try the same fly and then try a radically different fly. But once you know where a target bite is, oftentimes that's something that you can follow up and go back and use that as information to get that fish. It's hard to tell how long a fish are going to get spooked by fishing pressure, or how long it's going to take for them to reset after someone spooks them or they bite and they, feel the hook. Potentially they get hooked and come off. That fish is usually spooked. Sometimes a fish that gets hooked and comes off will bite again. Oftentimes on the bigger, smarter fish, that's game over for that day for that fish. But all of those fish that aren't caught, the bigger fish usually patrol these certain feeding lies that once you identify where they are in the pool in similar water conditions, that's the same point where that aggressive fish who wants to bite in that pool is likely to bite again. But it also shows you kind of where in the water flow that fish is looking for. So if the water comes up and it pushes the fish back to have the same sort of seam or not depth transition, but if the fish are using a certain, amount of current and the water doubles, where that amount of current is going to push further back into the pools. And as the water gets lower, oftentimes those fish will tuck up further into the more turbulent areas towards the head of the pool to use the bubbles and the current to be more protected. Whereas when the water is up or the water is turbid, those fish can sit out in places where there's more access to them. So oftentimes, even though it's harder for us to fish the water when it's high, the fish that we want to catch might be sitting in a place that's more accessible for us to cast to it when the water is high than where the fish is hiding when the water is low to stay safe, based on just the safety factor of when the water is up, how that makes the fish feel and how it uses the pool that it lives in, as the flows change. Those are things to consider. Today, we're in a position where a few days ago, the water was very high, nearly flood stage for streams like this. And as the water comes down from those high water events, you have a situation where the really big fish that might be nocturnal fish or might be the really spooky fish that are hard to approach in low water really come out and feed when the water is very high. And everything in a freestone stream is feeding pretty good during a high water event, and you catch the fish after the water's high, and the fish are firm and strong, and usually they're kind of shinier, and they've been eating a lot of protein, oftentimes worms and grubs and terrestrial things that get washed in from the rains. But the fish get fed well when the water is high. And so as the water is coming down from being high, the fish are not very hungry. And so that's the situation that we have right now, is we have water that's coming down from having been really high, and having the fish have been having that opportunity to get a lot of food and eat and feel full to the point that they don't want to fight as much current to look for the food, because right now they're digesting a lot of food and their body is packed with all the nutrients that they need for a little while. It doesn't mean that they won't eat, but it means that they're less likely to fight the current and hold up in the spots where we typically find them holding in the current, where the current brings food to the fish and they see those first opportunities to get that food. When the water comes down from being high like that, the fish are not as anxious to see that food, so they'll sit further back in the pools. And both of these fish that we caught today fishing this stream ate in positions a step back in the pool further than I typically even target water like this, where I look for where the current comes in and where there's the bubbles and the turbulence and the depth, where those fish are really covered and feel like they can't be seen by predators. But with the water being up, the fish will stay out kind of a little bit longer than the conditions dictate before they go back into cover and look for food further up in the current, and also hide from predators and things. When you see a very big fish out in the open in a stream like this, it's almost always right on the tail end of when the water is high. And I don't think they really know well when the water has gone down low enough for them to need to go back to safety. It's like, because it's a transition, there's no like red flag. And so oftentimes at the tail end of those events, you'll see those fish out, or you'll hook those fish out in places where they normally wouldn't be looking for for those types of food items. So that's a trend that I've seen fishing these high water events across the Northeast. That's something that I've seen over and over when there's a high water event, that as the water is coming down, the fish will be more out in the open and you can often catch them on the same flies that you weren't catching them in the same pool, and it's because of where they've moved to, and they still kind of have the guard down after that high water event. So today we're targeting some pretty deep water pools, and when the water is deep, it's hard to tell how deep the water really is. Once the water gets to a certain point where you can't visually see the bottom, how can you really tell exactly what the bottom is? And so I'm going to use this comparison, 8 versus 12. When the water is deep out of sight, a lot of times we have a longer leader rigging. If we're used to fishing some deeper water, that will cover pretty deep water. And so I'll see a lot of guys lengthening their leader long enough where I think 8 feet is a realistic expectation that's about as far as their fly is likely to get down, including the hydraulics of the water and the angle between the surface of the water and where the fly is down there. It's rarely ever perfectly straight up and down, where the distance between your sighter to the fly is the distance from the surface to the bottom. Usually you need to account for more of an angle than that. And so let's say two different anglers with two different approaches fish a piece of water that you can't see the bottom, and the deepest part of that pool is actually 12 feet deep. And the angler who isn't very flexible about their rigging goes over to the longer length that they're used to fishing their leader, which might be maybe 9-10 feet from a sighter, fishes through there, gets their fly about 8 feet down. And if your fly is 8 feet down over a 12-foot deep pool, and fish are used to eating food items that are denser than the water, so they sink, so they really never are floating up around in the water, when your fly is in that position, 8 feet down over 12 feet, it looks about as unnatural as a human floating off the ground, like 20 feet in the air. If you saw a human way off the ground, you would immediately say that's unnatural for some reason. And for the fish, when something like a crayfish or a grub that sinks in the water is not continuing to head towards the bottom in a big hydraulic pool, that's a red flag. And so how do you know how deep the pool is? So this guy that has his fly down there 8 feet deep drifts through, gets all the way down there, feels like he's gotten pretty deep, doesn't touch the bottom of the pool, fishes through. There's a fish down there that he goes right through the middle of the water column almost to the fish, well above the fish's head of where that fish near the bottom is seeing things like it's a crayfish eater. The crayfish are a dense thing. You put a crayfish in the water, it's going to sink at about that speed. It can't float up. There's no way in a hydraulic pool crayfish is moving towards the surface ever. Maybe the currents kick it up for a second, but for the most part, if that crayfish isn't at some point turning around and going to the bottom, clearly not right. How do you know what the depth is of your pool so you make a good presentation that shows that to the fish? And the answer is you're probably going to have to blow up the pool once, as far as doing something that might be overly aggressive that's going to spook the fish, to get a full idea of how that pool is shaped so that you can fish it well. To fish a pool great, you need to know the shape of it beforehand. Not that you can't go and catch a nice fish in a pool the first time you fish it, but if you really want to fish it in an optimal way, you need to probably see it in low water or see it in bright sunlight, walk right up on it so you can see right where the depth transitions are, where the deepest water is, and how the current would bring a food item down into that deepest water. Here's the strategy. You tie on some extra leader, and you tie on a heavy, like a Ned head or something, a simple fly that's disposable, that you're sending it to the bottom. It might get stuck. No big deal. That's what the fly is made for. You don't have too much time or materials exhausted in that fly. And then you put that fly, you cast it out, and you let that heavy fly that you know is going to get to the bottom go all the way to the bottom until you feel that thump and you see the line go slack. And if you need to extend your leader to feel that, with that heavy fly, you'll know when it stops going down. And it might take a lot longer line and time than you think. Even with a really heavy fly, once all of the deep water dynamics of the hydraulics, the current are involved, you can be surprised how long it takes for a heavy fly to get all the way to the bottom. Just by doing that, with the worst fly in your box, you might catch a trophy fish that hardly anyone was showing their fly to otherwise, because oftentimes it's a tough presentation to get a fly all the way to the bottom. And even if something doesn't bite it, you hit the bottom and you see how long of a leader it's going to take, including the dynamics of the water, to have your fly on the bottom and be able to have your sighter on the surface. Because once you hit the bottom, you can kind of come tight, and then you know what your realistic depth is in that spot. So the next time you approach that pool, you can adjust your rigging and leader to have that type of length so that you know that your fly is going to be able to go all the way to the bottom. And oftentimes, that's all it takes, is figuring out that right length to effectively get your fly just to the bottom where you're looking for strike detection. And just eating things off the bottom is a safety valve for so many fish that live in these deep spots, that just by being in a really deep spot, it's a little bit deeper than what's comfortable for people to present their lure or nymph or fly through. It keeps them safe a lot of the time from even seeing any presentation. So you'll see that I'm wearing all kind of drab color clothes. I'm wearing a camouflage hoodie that I might put the hood up at times when I'm approaching the water. And earlier in the day when I was catching those fish, I was wearing a full camouflage zip-up waterproof jacket as well, that's going to cover up even more of my kind of dark wader areas. And I think that in these clear water streams, when I try to approach into a position pretty close to the water, that having anything bright on your person, your hat, or even the line on your reel are all things that I think can spook the fish. And so I saw someone the other day out on the river, and perhaps they'll see this. They were wearing a bright orange hat, fishing a noted big wild trout stream, spooky, tough fish, hard place to catch a fish. And I told him that the bright orange hat, which was the first thing I saw on him from 75 yards upstream, would likely prevent him from effectively approaching a lot of the fish within casting range, just wearing that hat and moving around with that bright orange hat. And so on that same note, there's a certain mono that I like to use, Suffix Siege. It's tangerine orange, and when I put a fair amount of that on a reel, the outside of the reel is tangerine orange, the kind of fluorescent orange. And earlier this year, before the water came up from these rains, I felt like I was spooking fish in clear water as I was approaching them, wearing all this camouflage and holding out my rod with the bright tangerine orange line as I approached the pool to make a presentation. And when I looked in my reflection in my car, all my camouflage, that orange out in front of me, I was like, that's a very visible thing, and I'm moving it all around as I'm on top of these fish. I took off the orange line and I put on Maxima Chameleon so that the line was brown, and immediately felt like I was getting more fish at close range after I made that adjustment. And so, did it really make a difference? It's also the time of year fishing was getting good. It's hard to say that made that much of a difference, but things like that can, and they don't hurt. And so wearing the camouflage, or making sure that your hat isn't bright or your line isn't too bright on your reel, those are all things that if you can take a look at what game you're presenting to the fish, you might be able to clean up some things and prevent, you might still be catching fish, so you don't feel like you're spooking the fish, but you might catch a bigger fish or more fish if you clean up some of the things that might be spooking some of the fish. So that's the reason that I always go a little bit overboard on covering myself up when I'm fishing for fish that I think are spooky fish, because when you've seen how easily they can spook, you kind of get the idea that you can't do too much to prevent them from seeing you, because they can hear you crunch the gravel. They see your shadows. Like, it's easy for them to detect you. They're programmed to detect predators and to flee from them. So, you know, focusing on the things that you can control puts the odds more in your favor if you can do that. So I'm going to wrap up on that with this designer's angle, but those are a few thoughts that right now in the middle of this trout season are things that are fresh in my mind that are topical to helping get yourself on some of these nice adult fish that are tough and have other people chasing them around on the same streams.